Hello sewing and non-sewing friends, Shawnice here, and in this video segment I am going to be talking about seam finishes. The first seam finish I am going to demonstrate is the zigzag seam finish. So the first thing we need to do is create a seam. So we have our seam here. So I'm just going to go ahead and set my stitches. I'm going to press my seam open. And then press the seam open. So the zigzag stitch would be sewing a zigzag stitch right along the edge of the fabric. Okay, for the zigzag seam finish, this is for lightweight to medium fabric, and you're going to use a medium stitch width. And I'm going to go ahead and drop my needle to see where I'm at. There, and that's good. So I want to go right up to the edge. So now when I look at my edge, this is a zigzag seam finish. I'm actually going to use my pinking shears. Now, using pinking shears to finish your seam is not really recommended for something that you're going to wear. It's going to get some heavy use because eventually the fabric would start fraying or it can look tattered on the end. But for light use, pinking shears are good. So what you want to do is you want to cut. You don't want to cut. So sometimes, you know, if you're not worried about your seam that you have to change, you could probably really just cut in half, just like that. But if you want to keep your seam width, because you might have to do some alterations, say you're making a skirt and you might have to let the skirt out sometime in the future, you would take your pinking shears and you would just go right along this edge right here and try to take off as little as possible. So you can see how much I pretty much cut off. So you can see the difference between just cutting the fabric in half with pinking shears versus cutting the end. So this is going to go ahead and give you a nice clean finish. The next seam is the trim and zigzag seam finish. Trim and zigzag is exactly what it says. So what you're going to do, you're going to isolate your seam allowance. And you would use this if you were making something and when you were wearing it, that the seam on the back would show through. So if it was some type of a sheer fabric or a lightweight cotton, you would not want to have this thick seam showing from the right side of your fabric. So what you would do is you would trim your seam allowance in half. Then you're going to go to the machine and you're going to zigzag stitch along the edge of your new cut seam. Then I will slowly stitch right along the edge of my fabric. And there you have the trim and zigzag seam finish. The next seam finish I'm going to demonstrate is called stitch and pink. And that is where you stitch down your seam allowance and use your pinking shears to create that zigzag effect. Back at the pressing board, I'm going to go ahead and set my stitches. Let me open it up so that you can see clearly. So I have stitched along here. I'm going to isolate my seam, and with my pinking shears I am going to trim close to that stitching line. I do not want to go through that stitching line. So that is the example of stitch and pink seam finish. The next seam finish I'm going to demo is called the hand overcast. And you would use this on but I would say you would use this on fabric that is bulky or thick, and it's just a small area. You wouldn't do a whole seam like this, but it's in a small area, and either you can't get it underneath you can't get that area underneath your machine to stitch it, or say you don't have a machine that has a zigzag stitch, but you have a machine that only does straight stitching. So this is the technique that you could use. So what you'll do is you will stitch your fabric together, and then you would stitch a 1/4 inch away from your edge. I'm going to go ahead and set my stitch so you can see the stitch there. Then you're going to cut off half of your seam allowance. And then the hand overcast is as it says. With your hand sewing needle, you're going to overcast the edge. So using the same piece, we're going to go ahead and talk about the next stitch, which is called the fold and stitch. So you have your regular seam allowance. I would isolate it. Then I would fold it, fold 1/8 of it over on the edge. I'm going to go ahead and press that. Then you're going to go to the machine and you're going to stitch straight along that edge. You're going to make sure that the bottom stays under that fold. You got to really guide it underneath there, because the feed dogs will try to get this and pull it away from you, because you're really only stitching on one side. And there you have the fold and stitch. And here's the underside of it. So if you can imagine both sides like that, that's a very beautiful stitch. The next stitch is the bias bound stitch, and this is a stitch that you would use if you were making something using a very bulky or heavy fabric, or say if you were going to be making a jacket, a denim jacket, and it was not going to be lined on the inside. This is a very good technique to use to finish your seams. So you would need bias tape and a seam. So I'm going to go ahead and, as I've done in the other demos, I'm going to press my seam open. I'm going to isolate my seam. Now here's the bias tape that I have. And so you're going to fold this. You're not going to fold it in half. You want to fold it so that one side is smaller than the other. Like such. You're going to keep the wider side of the binding on the bottom, and you're going to slide it underneath. You're going to sandwich your seam inside. And I'm going to grab some pins. And I'm going to secure my bias tape. And then I'm going to go to the machine and give it a nice stitch. just holding the fabric inside the bias tape. Now look at that. Now that is a beautiful seam finish. So you could do the inside of your jacket. Here's the back part. So the wider part goes on the wider part goes on the bottom. The shorter edge goes on the top, and you stitch right down. It's a good, beautiful seam finish. The final stitch that I am going to be demonstrating in this video is a couture seam finish, and it is called the Hong Kong finish. You're going to isolate your seam allowance, and then I have bias tape that I made, right sides together. Go ahead and pin our bias tape to our seam. Now we'll take this to the machine and we're going to stitch 1/4 inch from the edge of our seam allowance. Getting a little bit off my seam, my edge there. Just checking to make sure that my seam allowance is underneath the tape. I'm going to go ahead and trim my bias tape. Give that a good press. I'm going to isolate my seam allowance and I'm going to trim. Then I'm going to take my seam allowance and I'm going to fold it under to the seam, the stitch. I'm folding it under. So there's 2 stitches underneath here. The stitch on the right is the stitch holding the seam together, and the stitch on the left is the stitch holding the bias tape to the seam. So I'm folding the bias tape to the stitch that's on the right. I'm going to give it a nice little press. Going to flip it over. I'm going to secure with some pins here. Trying not to, making sure that everything is enclosed there. So now I'm going to go back to the machine and I'm going to stitch in the ditch. Stitching in a ditch is when you have a ditch, which is going to be the area where your fabrics touch and are sewn together. We are going to focus our needle. One of the few times that you should watch your needle, we're going to stitch right along this crease. So I'm going to make sure that the needle drops right in that ditch. And it is okay to stop, take out pins, reposition your hands, check, making sure that you are where you want to be, and take your time. Because in-home sewing, unless you're in a sewing contest, there's no prize for finishing first. for finishing fast. Finish first, finish fast. Okay, I'm going to back stitch. And there you have, that is your seam. So here's the front edge. You can see I've stitched right along that ditch. That's stitching in a ditch. On the other side, all your raw edges are underneath, so they won't be exposed to the wear, the daily wear for your fabric. But that is a couture finish and one of my favorites. This is Shawnice. Thanks for watching. Loves. Hey sewing and non-sewing friends, Shawnice here, and I am popping in with a special announcement. If you have not heard, I am offering a 4-week beginner's course on sewing a classic shirt, because I believe that a beginner who knows how to operate a machine, meaning they know the parts of their sewing machine, they know how to thread their machine and troubleshoot their machine, but you've never sewn a garment before. And I am challenging myself and challenging you as a beginner sewer that with the right instruction, with some patience and some forgiveness, because you'll make mistakes, I've made mistakes, but the beginner sewer can sew the classic shirt. I believe that. I'm challenging myself, and I challenge you to step up there, challenge yourself and see if this is something that you can do. You're going to come out with the skills to keep trying it over and over again. We'll go through the pattern, talk about the different steps in the pattern. What do they mean? What do the steps mean? How to interpret that? Give you some tips and techniques along the way. And this course is being offered to 4 individuals. So we're going to be in this private Facebook room where I will be dropping some gems, some tips and techniques on things that you can do to sew your shirt fast, but not too fast, because I don't believe in rushing, but fast and simple. We're going to talk about some hand sewing techniques. We're going to talk about shortcuts, and it's only going to be offered in my private Facebook group. So if that is you, if you are up to the challenge, I invite you to come on over to Learn to Sew Rochester and sign up. www.learntosewrochester.com. This course is a beta course, meaning that there's going to be a symbiotic relationship. I am going to be teaching you, and you are going to be teaching me how to be a better teacher. Now this class, because it is a beta course, it's being offered at a very, very low price. So now is the time to step up to get good teaching, good instructions on sewing the tailored shirt. Again, www.learntosewrochester.com, and I hope to see you there. Thanks for watching. Bye.